Okay. Buenos días a todos. Good morning, everyone, especially the members of el Colegio de la Frontera Norte Research Ethics Committee who were able to join us today. I would also like to greet those following us in social media on Facebook and YouTube. Let me introduce myself. I am Hilda Garcia Perez, Director of el Colegio de la Frontera Norte en Nogales, Sonora. And I would like to thank Dr. Christine Melton Lopez for her willingness to share the University of Arizona's experience and expertise in human subject protections with the professors and students of El Colegio de la Frontera Norte. This annual conference serves as a training activity for members of the Research Ethics Committee, researchers, and graduate students, focusing on the ethical aspects of social research involving vulnerable population, including migrants, children, and indigenous communities. This is our first conference of its kind, but we plan to hold several more, providing opportunities for El Colegio de la Frontera Norte Research Ethics Committee to exchange experiences and knowledge. As you know, El Colegio de la Frontera Norte Research Ethics Committee is a collegiate body that reflects our commitment to ethics and institutional transparency with the academic community, with society as a whole, and especially with research participants. His main objective is to protect the right, dignity, and well-being of people who participate in scientific research as subjects, as well as those responsible for conducting the research, particularly during the information collection stage, by evaluating and providing ethical opinions on research protocols. I would like to invite our academic community to visit El Colegio de la Frontera Norte Research Ethics Committee website for more information. Now I'm going to read a brief bio of our guests. Dr. Christine Melton Lopez is a seasoned institutional review board professional with a Master of Science degree in Clinical Research Management for America for Arizona State University and certifications in IRB regulation. With over a decade of experience in research administration, she serves as the director of the Human Subject Protections Program at the University of Arizona. In this role, Dr. Christine Melton provides crucial oversight for the Human Subject Protections Programs, IRB Operation and IRB and Research Compliance Program. Her dedications to the field extends beyond her administrative responsibilities as she actively participates in the Health Equity Partnership of the Arizona Consortium. This consortium's mission is to advance health equity in underrepresented and underserved community through all Arizona. Notably, Dr. Melton works at the University of Arizona, a Hispanic serving institution, is centered on promoting engagement and inclusion in research, further emphasizing her commitment to making a positive impact in the academic and healthcare community. We welcome Dr. Melton Lopez, and the title of her presentation is Human Research Protections and Considerations from an IRB. Welcome, Dr. Melton.
Thank you so much, Hilda. I appreciate it. Let me go ahead and share my presentation. All righty. Hold on one second. Okay, perfect. All right. So thank you all for having me here today. I think this is my first international presentation. So it's really cool to be here today. And I wish I could be there in person. Apologies that I was not able to make it. I'm Christine. I started in this research world back in 2008 as an undergraduate researcher at the University of Arizona. I started my time as a researcher doing informed consents, collecting surveys, redacting medical records. And I really got my taste for research life and After I graduated with my bachelor's degree, I saw there was an opening at the IRB, and I applied and I got the position, and the rest is history. I really have found my place in human subjects protections. But I will start my presentation with a caveat that I am by no means an expert. I learn something new every single day. I'm surrounded by incredibly smart individuals and researchers who could probably give the presentation better than I. So if you think of something, there's going to be some time at the end for all of us to kind of brainstorm and talk about these issues and strategies that we could all use together when dealing with more vulnerable types of populations. So with that, we'll go ahead and get started. So I do want to respectfully acknowledge that the University of Arizona is on the lands and territories of Indigenous people. Arizona is home to 22 federally recognized tribes, and the U of A has a really deep commitment to serving Native American populations and communities and really building a partnership to move forward into the future. So I really hope today that you'll walk away with fundamental concepts and best practices and research strategies that you can use as researchers or as an ethics board to protect vulnerable populations, including migrants and Indigenous communities. So as you might be aware, one of the age-old questions we get at the Institutional Review Board is, why do I need an ethics committee to oversee my work? So I like to begin presentations by showing an ethical timeline of some of the research injustices that have occurred over the years. And at the bottom of the timeline are things that have been put into place to avoid these situations from happening again. So in the middle of this timeline, you can see the establishment of an institutional review board came into play in the mid-1970s. And we see a lot fewer research injustices occur, but we still see them, right? So some of these stick out, at least in my mind, are displayed on this slide. So at the top left-hand corner of the slide, is a really infamous study. It's can you guys hear me okay? Okay. I'm getting a notice that my internet's unstable. Hopefully it doesn't persist, but let me know if it does. So at the top of this slide is the Tuskegee syphilis trials. This study was funded by the United States government. And what the purpose of the study is to look at the disease progression of syphilis. And unfortunately, these researchers targeted an underserved, very poor population in the state of Alabama, predominantly African-American males. And they sold to them this idea that they were getting free health care and that they were getting burial insurance, when in reality, they were being exploited for research purpose. And I say exploited because in the middle of this trial, penicillin came out as a treatment for syphilis, and that was withheld. That knowledge was withheld from this population intentionally. And so, as you can imagine, I mean, harm pursued and persisted in this particular community, and it was a very unfortunate case. In the middle of this PowerPoint, we have a picture of doctors during the Holocaust. You know, these individuals were subjected to some pretty serious and severe conditions. Some of these individuals had their limbs cut off, so doctors could see, how much pain can a human body endure. There was a lot of psychological studies that occurred. And then we have some more recent studies. So at the top right-hand corner, we have a young man. His name is Jesse Gelsinger. He was 18 years old when he decided to enroll into a gene therapy study. It was the first gene therapy study. It occurred out of the University of Pennsylvania. And unfortunately, the first treatment of the gene therapy he received, he passed away hours after treatment. And through investigation, it turns out that Jesse did not meet the inclusion criteria for that study, so it was not safe for him to enroll. So as you can see, these are just this is a very quick snapshot of why ethics committees matter, why our job is so important, because we're the front lines, making sure that things like this do not repeat into the future. So hopefully by now, you all realize or know already that the point of an institutional review board or an ethics committee is to protect the rights and welfare of subjects that participate in research activities. But how did we come to be? So the National Commission for the Protections of Human Subjects established this concept of an IRB. It happened in the mid-1970s. And this just wasn't an idea that was birthed overnight. NIH was actually toying with an ideal of an ethics committee. So NIH already had a small group of individuals that would review proposals from an ethical standpoint and would approve or disapprove a study. So that really bloomed into the concept of an ethics committee or an IRB committee that we know today. And in 1978, we were given the set of ethical principles that govern human research. We still use them today at our IRB. It's called the Belmont Report. So the Belmont Report has 3 principles, and I'll dive into what each of those principles mean. The first one is respect for persons. So it really just means that we treat our participants as autonomous agents. Everyone should be able to make an informed decision about whether or not they want to take part in a research study. It also means that we're adding in additional protections into a study plan if someone lacks capacity or has diminished capacity. So a good example of that would be, enrollment of children in a research study. Children cannot provide consent for themselves, so we would build in parental permission in a study like that. In addition to parental permission, we would build in child assent, right? So even if parent says, yeah, it's okay for my child to take part, child still gets to make their decision of whether or not they take part, only after the parent makes the decision first. The next principle is beneficence. It's maximizing the good for the participant, science, community, etc. And it also means that we're avoiding any unnecessary risks, harm or wrong. So it would be very rare for an ethics committee to approve a study in which the participant would walk away with more harm than good. In my time at the IRB, I've been here 11 years. I've only seen 2 studies disapproved, and that's because the investigator was unwilling to work with the IRB to kind of balance out that risk-benefit situation. And then the last principle is justice, and that's ensuring that everyone gets to bear the benefits and burdens of research. And I have it highlighted green because I really feel like this principle, the justice principle, is what's driving our discussion today, right? We are not excluding a particular population because they're inconvenient, but it also means that we're not including a particular population just because they are super convenient. So that is the Belmont Report. We use it on every study we review. If we see a study that comes in and the investigator doesn't want to seek informed consent, we'll pull up the Belmont Report and we'll say, hey, investigator, one of the principles of the Belmont Report is respect. It means we're getting informed consent from our participants. You need to develop an informed consent plan. So we get lots of rules from the Belmont Report. Like I said, for the respect principle, we get informed consent. We get the justification to need to respect privacy of our participants. For beneficence, it means that we're making sure that these studies that we're approving have good research design. Are the investigators competent to complete the aims of the research study, right? Because if they're not, are they just wasting our participants' time? Is there a favorable risk-benefit analysis? And then with the justice principle, is there equitable selection of subjects? Has the researcher done their due diligence to include a sample that represents that entire population and not just certain groups of that population? So when we start thinking about the principle of justice, like I said, everyone should get the opportunity to take part in research. And as an ethics committee, as an IRB, we have a huge responsibility to ensure that investigators are holding up their end of this, right? We have a role in ensuring equitable selections of subjects are occurring. Sometimes the IRB or the ethics committee is the only committee even seeing this study, especially when something's not funded, doesn't have any outside partnerships. We might be the only group that gets to see this study. And it's not just important to the IRB, it's also important to federal regulators. You can Google it. There are statements from NSF, FDA, and NIH that are calling for more diverse representation in the research data that we collect. So a quote recently released by the NIH says, in spite of all of these advancements in scientific research, we're still seeing that research isn't available to all of us equally. And NIH lists 4 groups that they feel is underrepresented in research. So they call out, certain members from racial and ethics groups are missing. Individuals with disability, physical or mental impairment are also missing in our samples. Individuals from disadvantaged backgrounds and even women, right? And that seems crazy. But yeah, we're missing the mark here. So something needs to be done. So when we start thinking about being more represented in our samples, how do we actually accomplish this, right? Because there's so much to think about when you're including someone vulnerable. There's lots more moving parts here. I really think it's a partnership, quite honestly, between ethics committee and the researchers to really come together and both of us do our parts so that we're making sure that our subject selection is more equitable. But let's define what is vulnerable. And I'll share with Hilda my PowerPoint slides, but I found a really great article that really digs deep into what's vulnerable, what's vulnerability. And what this particular article says is vulnerability in the context of research should be understood to be a condition that some individuals experience that put them at a greater risk of being used ethically in inappropriate ways for research purposes. So when you go back to one of my beginning slides, like the Tuskegee study, right? Those individuals were from a remote city. They came from disadvantaged backgrounds. They were poor. They didn't have much scope beyond the city in which they lived in, especially in those times. They were vulnerable, right? They deserved extra protections built into that research plan. And vulnerable in research also means that these individuals may have difficulty in providing voluntary informed consent. Maybe there's limitations in decision making. Maybe there's but that also puts them at risk for right? And just overall, vulnerable populations have an increased likelihood of being wronged or being incurred in digital harm. So tons to think about, but when I say this is a partnership, right? It's the ethics board in partnership with the investigators. What are things that we can do to kind of manage these issues? So I'm going to first talk about actionable strategies that investigators can use. It's really interesting. We have a researcher at the University of Arizona, and he's currently studying why there was mistrust during the COVID vaccines from various populations. In Southern Arizona, we have a large proportion of Spanish-speaking populations, and I'll be the first to admit, our researchers, our institution doesn't do the greatest job in attracting Spanish speakers. Why not? So we do have a researcher studying this exact thing. And one of the things he's found is that at least the Spanish speakers in our community, one of their barriers that they reported to our researchers that the recruitment material just was not clear. It did not fully explain what they would be asked to do, what would be the time commitment, what would they be getting themselves into to enroll into our COVID vaccine studies. So it really just shines a light that our researchers have to think about developing culturally tailored materials. We also need to provide materials in the languages of relevance for whatever, region in the world we're going to be recruiting from. We need to have our materials ready in their language. And we need to make sure that we're using professional services to translate those documents. But also, here's a really big thing right here. We need to have our researchers build flexibility in the protocol. When we start thinking about, populations that have maybe a physical handicap, it may not be feasible to ask these individuals to, get in a car, drive to the institution, walk a block to get to the building, walk up 5 flights of stairs to have a study visit, right? So we have to think about allowing remote visits, telehealth visits. Maybe someone can't leave their house. Maybe they have young children at home, or they're taking care of their aging mom or dad, right? They can't also leave their home. So we have to be flexible. I remember when I was in the thick of parenthood, when I had 2 children under the age of 2, there was no way I was leaving my house. And I remember feeling, this was during the height of COVID, I especially wasn't leaving the house, right? I wasn't going to risk taking my babies in public. It just wasn't going to happen. But I had this desire to start, getting in a healthier lifestyle, working out. Well, how could I do that, right? With 2 young kids. So what I did was I looked up free workouts on YouTube, and I was met where I was at that time in my life, and I was very successful in this at-home program. I say that to say that it also translates to research, right? Sometimes we can't reach these vulnerable populations because there's no way they can physically get to us. They have some sort of limitation, right? So it's important that we reach communities where they are. How do we know, though, if our materials, our recruitment documents, our consent forms are culturally tailored and relevant and make sense? Well, my most favorite action item is community consultations, right? The researcher needs to seek out stakeholders, experts in the field, the community representatives, and get feedback on that research plan even, way prior to the submission of the ethics review, right? Meeting with the community, getting feedback really can help build a strong research foundation to ensure that we're reaching all populations and not just certain convenient populations, right? This is one thing that I see lacking in a lot of submissions that come to my office, is just a lack of feedback from the community. But I think it would really go a long way if researchers stop and just see the value in something like this. So some things to think about if you do embark on community consultations as an investigator is you want to make sure to be really transparent about the study. Provide clear instruction, understandable information, and promote two-way conversation. So if the community is providing you feedback, make sure you take that feedback and incorporate it, rightfully so. I've seen some researchers get to the point of community consultations, but they get to that point where they have already written their protocol and they're unwilling to change it. So, is it really a consultation if you're unwilling to revise what you've already written? It's why it's important to start that at the onset of your research study. So those are some actionable strategies for investigators, but what about for us folks that live in the ethics land, the IRB lands? We can do. Well, one, we have to recognize when someone, our population, is vulnerable. Even things like perceptions of communities can make them vulnerable. So think about migrant populations. There could be stereotypes that the community has for migrant populations, or any population. But it's up to us as ethics committee directors and members to recognize those and just make sure that we're having the investigator put in those safeguards to avoid something like that. Also, potentially vulnerable populations like migrants could be susceptible to power dynamics. So, we all are susceptible to that. Think about when you go to the doctor, like you're trusting what your doctor is saying because they're in a power position. Researchers can also be seen as in a power position. So when we're looking at a research plan, are those dynamics acknowledged, and are there any strategies to implement any reduction in that power imbalance? So things to think about would be, when a subject's given an informed consent form, are they given time to read the informed consent? Ideally, they'd be given time to take the consent home, read it, ask questions. Timing of consent matters as well. Let's say you're waiting to be wheeled back into surgery, right? You're nervous. You're not maybe thinking 100% clear. That would not be a time for a researcher to enter the room and try to consent you for a research study. Also, think about, are there any economic issues at play that could put someone at risk for undue influence? Subject compensation, in my opinion, is important. I don't think that we should exclude compensating subjects. I think subjects should be compensated for their time, energy, and effort, but just making sure that that compensation is fair and it's just is really important. And then just looking at the informed consent, in my opinion, the informed consent is the most important document we as an ethics committee reviews and approves. It's what everyone sees. It represents the institution. So that informed consent needs to be understandable. The human subjects regulations in the United States, we shoot for a reading level no greater than 8th grade reading level. Despite the population. So the consent form should be understandable. The sentences should be shorter. If there is medical jargon, it should be put in layman's terms. The use of bullet points really goes a long way in a consent form rather than large blocks of text. It gets muddy, and from just a user standpoint, it's harder to understand. The use of visual aids to understand more complex topics are wonderful. Because if we build all of these strategies into the informed consent process, we're going to have a reader that understands more what they're being asked to do. There's no surprises there if we really take a meaningful look at our informed consent document. So I know we're here today to talk in particular about research with migrant populations, and I'll put the caveat out there. I am just one IRB director in Tucson, Arizona. I'm not the expert here, but I have seen studies come through dealing with this populations, and here are some of the considerations I've seen our IRB take into play. So we have to understand legal status of someone like a migrant taking part in a research study. Unfortunately, federal tax requirements say that, if someone is compensated X amount or more, we have to collect that person's social security number. So what if that person doesn't have a social security number? And we're notating that in our research records, and we're connecting that information with that person's name. That puts them at risk, right? So what I've seen our researchers do is they stay below that threshold, right? So that we don't even have to ask for social security number for tax reporting purposes. Again, I know I mentioned it on the other slide, but we have to think about power dynamics at play between the researcher and participants. We have to think about different ways to get informed consent. It is not one size fits all. So the standard at the University of Arizona is we're getting signed informed consent from every participant, but sometimes that's not the cultural norm. We have lots of studies that take part in remote African villages, and it is taboo to ask these remote village leaders to sign a formal document. And so we have waived the requirement to obtain informed consent. Or let's say the information that we're collecting is very sensitive, and the only record that links the participant to this research study is their first and last name signed on the consent form. There's no question about it. We're going to waive signed consent in that case, right? Because we're looking for ways to. We have some studies that go on in our institution where participants are disclosing, their sexual orientation. Maybe they're not out yet, and it's something that is very, very private to them. It would be a big deal if that research data was linked out to the public. So we have to think about creative ways to ensure that the data is far separated from the identity. We have to think about competent researchers, right? Because sometimes if we're doing research that focuses on mental health, or it asks participants to relive like a traumatic event, maybe a past sexual assault, a trauma from childhood, we're never going to be able to release 100% of that risk. There's going to be some risk. One way we can reduce the risk is making sure that the researchers that are going out in the field are competent by their skills, background, and training to ask these questions and ask them in a sensitive, right manner. I saw a study once, and I'm probably going to butcher this, but essentially it was a study about individuals that were just diagnosed with cancer. And it was about, their feelings about, end of life care, making a will, those sort of considerations. And these researchers found that the amount of emotional harm was a lot more when researchers were like undergraduate researchers asking these questions versus like an oncologist researcher who had been doing this type of study for years and years. There's just a level of sensitivity that someone doing this for many years has that someone, fresh out of college is lacking and needs more time. So that's something that before I read that study, I never really appreciated that fact that it does matter who's out there in the field asking these questions. And a huge, big piece of this is data protection. How can we ensure that we're keeping the identities private? So if you're doing something like qualitative researchers where subjects are asked to provide narratives of their experiences, then that protocol needs to talk about how the transcripts and quotes can't be directly traced back to participants. I personally, for me, I always tell my investigators, like, if you don't have to use a direct quote, don't use a direct quote. In my time as IRB director, I've really only seen one study where I had a participant complain to me that, there was a researcher at the U of A, they were interviewing subjects about their political affiliations, their sexual orientation. And the participant read the published article. Them and their friend group knew exactly who was being spoken about in this article, even though names were never given. It's just the population was so tiny, people were able to link back their answers and identify one another. And it caused issues in this friend group. It turns out the study was not approved by the IRB. And I think that's why that situation occurred, because if it's something that we would have saw, we would have definitely just completely had the investigator change the plan. But these things happen, and that's why providing additional protections to anonymize direct quotes is really worthwhile. Researchers need to use institutional approved cloud storage methods that require an authenticated login. And access to those folders need to be limited to whoever the ethics committee approved to be on those folders. Here at the University of Arizona, we have RedCap and we have Box Health. We know that those platforms are secure. They're protected. When we get research plans that talk about, I'm just going to store my research data on a flash drive or an encrypted drive, it's not good enough, right? If we have a cloud storage, let's use cloud storage, especially if the researcher is traveling. One, I think by now we can all say we really don't need paper records, right? And two, if we're not going to store data directly into a cloud and we're just carrying the data on our laptop could get lost. Laptop could be seized at the airport. You never know what could happen. And that's why it just makes the most sense to put your data immediately into the cloud that your institution sponsors, because we can all know that it's going to be protected. We need to encourage our researchers, especially dealing with migrant communities, to limit the collection of identifiable data. Collect only the minimum necessary. Do you need identifiable data? Is it going to add anything to your final analysis? Sometimes it's necessary, especially if you're following subjects, long term. You would need a way to kind of link their data back to their identity. But if you don't, then don't collect it. Sometimes our investigators want to audio or video record a conversation and make sure they have their notes correctly, and that's fine, but there needs to be a plan to transcribe the data and delete the original audio and video files. And if the researcher, for whatever reason, has a scientific rationale why that can't be done, then it needs to be fully explained in the informed consent, like taking video of you. There aren't immediate plans to delete the video. Here's how we're going to use it into the future, and here's how we're going to protect it so that the participant can make that decision of whether or not they want to proceed. Now, I would be amiss to not bring up research with Native communities. It is a large portfolio that we have at the University of Arizona because Arizona is home to 22 federally recognized tribes. Because we sit on Native lands at the University of Arizona, we have a really strong foundation when it comes to conducting research with Native American tribes and indigenous populations in general. Some of the things that I have learned in my tenure here at the U of A is, first and foremost, Native tribes are sovereign. They self-govern their land, their people, their resources. So if you're considering research with indigenous populations, Native populations, you have to go in with that mindset that they control what happens on their lands with their people. And each tribe is going to have a different procedure to get research approved through that tribe. So here at the University of Arizona, we have a website that has a ton of tribes listed, and those tribes, there's a hyperlink, and you can see how each tribe does their research approval process differently. So when we talked about community consultation at the start, that's where this becomes extremely important. Before you have that protocol finalized, make sure you're following community consultations with Native tribes. Make sure you're reaching out to the proper approval mechanisms to get the research approved. Keep in mind, too, that Native nations are keepers of their knowledge, their cultural practices, their traditions, and they choose when and how to share that with researchers. And anytime you're working with Native tribes or on Native lands, you gotta get informed consent, and it has to be in good faith. I know that there are some tribes that aren't federally recognized, but are still nonetheless important, relevant, significant. Sometimes it's hard to reach those approval mechanisms, but researchers still in good faith have to try. And again, I hope it goes without saying, but has to be fully informed. Some other considerations is data ownership. Typically, when you're dealing with Native nations or indigenous populations, that nation is going to retain data ownership. And so you have to make sure that you're articulating that in your protocol and that you're articulating that in the informed consent that, hey, after this data is collected and will be transferred back to the tribe. And also, it's really important to re-seek approval for as long as that study is going on. Because, tribal chair composition changes, and sometimes what one chair approved, another chair won't. So make sure that you're being proactive and reaching out to that tribe every year just with a status update to ensure that you still have that approval secured. And two, sometimes, especially like if you're not recruiting off of tribal lands, but you are recruiting someone that's affiliated with a tribe or a indigenous population, that participant needs to be aware that some of the information found out could have some potential harm to the tribe, because they need to make that personal decision of whether or not they want to still enroll despite of this information. But sometimes published results conflicts with these culture, traditions, creation stories, and spiritual beliefs. I would say most tribes will want to proofread a publication before it's released to the public. And so even more the need to do that community consultation. So those expectations are outlined before you even start. And two, you have to think about future use of data. Most federal regulators, funders are requiring open data sharing. And, it's going to be up to the tribe whether or not that they'll allow that open use of their tribal data. But it's something you have to consider because you got to get that worked out before you start collecting the data. And, once the research study is over, doesn't stop that consultation, that discussions with the community. Researchers owe it to the people in which they've drawn the data for to give the data back, to explain what the results mean, how it impacts the community. That two-way sharing of information is going to just increase the trust that the community has for research and researchers. I mean, we saw during the COVID era how much mistrust still exists out there. And I think as a director of an ethics committee, as researchers, we can acknowledge that maybe we haven't done a great job in sharing back the data with the community that it came from. But it also extends to giving back resources to the community. We have a researcher here at the university who researches like obesity and liver issues in Hispanic males in particular. It could be a taboo topic. And one of the things that he does is he scans livers to look at the health status of the liver. And he recruits from community events. You can often find him at the swap meet in Tucson, advertising his studies. The really cool thing about what he does is if someone doesn't want to enroll into the study, that's fine. They can still lay down and get their liver scanned, and he'll give them a printout of what the scan says and says, take it to your doctor. You don't ever have to sign up for my research study, but I'm still going to give back to this community. A really cool thing about that is he's identified some liver cancers, some cases of cirrhosis of the liver, and he's been able to get these people to immediately go to their doctor with this information and get treatment without ever signing up for a research study, right? It's just really simple things that we can do to give back and to promote trust in research. I have spoken a lot, so I want to hear from the strategies you and your research teams have implemented to kind of address some of these issues. So I'm gonna hand it to you all.
Okay. Who wants to address some of the issues that maybe we have been facing?
Well, I have a comment, and First, thank you for your talk, and very interesting and important things to consider as researchers as well. And I was thinking on this last comment you made about compensation or a way to retribute to the people that participates or not participates in the research. And I was thinking on that through your presentation, because compensation, I think it's very important. And that's something that we need to consider, but also to explore the way to compensate in a manner that does not compromise the willingness to participate, especially thinking about migrant populations or population living in conditions of precarity that are having low access to certain resources. So sometimes the money compensation is a way to have access to the resource, and they compromise their willingness to share their stories, thinking about more qualitative research with these populations. So I was thinking on the strategies we have implemented in some research projects I have participated. It's similar to what you were saying about the study focus on labor, but thinking about migrants rather than compensating individually the people that participate with money or something material. What we have done is giving back something to the shelter where they are living. Then the whole population in the shelter can have a benefit of the research in a way, or to be compensated in a way.
Yeah.
Rather than compromising the willingness of those that will participate just for the compensation they will have, but not because they are really interested in sharing their stories. So I don't know if that makes sense, but that's one way we have tried to address the issue of thinking on compensation and still maintaining the willingness to participate or the freedom to participate.
Right. No, I love that. And it's so funny because when I first started at the IRB, compensation was taboo. We couldn't call compensation a benefit, even though people deserve to be compensated for their time, energy, and effort. But it's a fine line, right? Because you don't want the compensation to be the motivator, right? And to get people to sign up for something they super comfortable with signing up. I like your suggestion of more doing broad compensation to kind of benefit the larger population. What we've done at the University of Arizona is we make sure that the compensation matches the standard in the city of enrollment in terms of like minimum wage. So like for Tucson, minimum wage, I want to say is about $16 an hour. So if a study is taking 2 hours, then we would say, okay, then subjects fair and just compensation would be at the rate of $16 an hour. But still, I mean, with vulnerable populations, that could still raise issues, but at least we know that their time is worth money and we're compensating them at the rate of like that a job would compensate them at. And then sometimes we have to think about too how we're compensating. So if we're like enrolling individuals experiencing homelessness, it might put them in danger to give them straight cash, like $40 cash, right? They could get mugged, or you could think of a ton of things that could go wrong. So then maybe in those cases, you're compensating with a gift card at a grocery store, or a restaurant or what have you. So I do wish there was more guidance out there surrounding compensation, because I think we're all doing it a little bit differently. But yeah, compensation is a real big one.
Yeah. Thank you, Dr. Malcolm. There are another comment or questions? Yeah, Luis?
Hi, everyone. Christine, thank you so much for your input. We do a lot of this kind of approaches to communities, not in the sense of the Colegio, no, the Colef, because there of what I have seen is more the approach with migrants that are not within their communities, no?
Yeah.
So we have certain rules that we do apply for consultation of indigenous people, for example, no, or of certain communities. The Supreme Court has ruled on that, and we have new laws on consultation, but they do not address this direct individual consultation process. So we have to do with these ethical rules that we are discussing here, no? And it's a good guidance.
Yeah.
Yes, compensation is one important one. I think that the law does not in any way invalidate or restrict the possibility of a just compensation. It's a matter of contract. What it says is that the one doing the research, the carga, the charge of the effort is in the one that is doing the research, because the other ones are in a different position, in a weak position.
Yeah.
So it falls upon us to determine what is considered to be just, because they are not going to access really, they are never going to access the justice system to say, hey, these guys did not do whatever was, it rests upon us. No,
Yeah.
We're going to be actually judged by our peers or by the authorities or by other institutions, but not by the real affected parties, no, if any, no, they could be considered so. So I think that what we are looking always is for guidance, for better ways to do what we do, no, and if any, I would love to discuss how to write down these better approaches, because the law is not going to give us anything or very little in Mexico to do this, no, and maybe some ethical things that are in Convention 169 of the labor organization, or in the Mexican Constitution, or in the decisions of the court. But those are going to be minimal. We have to guide ourselves by those, but it will be really an effort of the Colegio and of the institutions. Not of we are not going to give. We are not going to have a lot of information from the legal documents, no, or protocols.
We feel the same here at the institution, because the regulations, they just say make it fair and just, but they don't define what that means. And it's hard, and especially in the United States, when we were subjected to, federal tax reporting.
Mm-hmm.
It makes it exceptionally hard, because if we compensate $50 or more, we have no choice. We have to collect Social Security number. Okay, does that exclude then this entire population that will never be able to touch because they don't have Social Security numbers, right? And that's not living up to the principle of justice of the Belmont Report, but it's just like us at the ground level that's like screaming and it's like, no, we got to do something differently. And those in the higher positions are just kind of turning a blind eye to it. So I hear your struggle, and it would actually be a really interesting maybe study to embark on, to see how are ethics committees navigating this concept of compensation, especially when we're dealing with potentially vulnerable populations.
Right. I agree.
Yeah.
Maybe we're discussing the group that the kind of work, because we really need to come with a protocol. I offer that at least I can help with giving everyone the limits in the Mexican legislation, no, so that we can work out the gaps. But that we have to do that, for sure.
Yeah.
No.
Yeah. I want to share something that I had been observing when we are doing research in the border, is that we have many institutions trying to do the same research, focus on the same population. And you are going to find that there is a point in which people don't really want to participate because, did you know, everybody wants to reach them and to do research of them. And that's something that really worried me because it's what could be the best way for different universities, I don't know, to organize, to do research and not to focus most of them in the same people because, okay, it's important that we get information, but at the same time, we have students, we have researchers, we have many universities in some way, I don't know, maybe doing some damage to these people. I don't know. That's something that really worried me.
Yeah. You're right. We call it survey fatigue at the institution. We see it. Especially in-house. We're always blocking researchers that just want to open the University of Arizona phone book and flood the members with surveys, interviews, all those sorts of things. In the COVID era in particular, we saw a surge of clinical trials being proposed at our hospital. And what we had to do, and we had to do this almost overnight, was establish a research review committee. And it was backed by our institution, so we had some authority there, and we had to pick and choose what studies we approved and what studies we disapproved. Because if we approved them all and all at the same time, you couldn't go to the hospital to get services for COVID without being approached by 10 different people for 10 different reasons. And there's so many ethical reasons why that's wrong, and also some safety things you have to consider. I would say that's a hard issue to tackle when you're talking about research, remote research on the border. I'd imagine the strongest fight against that would just be establishing partnerships between the institutions and seeing if you could do something like a research oversight board that has representatives from all of these different units or organizations that either approve or disapprove research. I also think that because the regulators are moving towards open source data, that maybe we don't have to keep collecting the same survey data over and over again. We can tap into what's available via open source and get data in that way. If we've already asked these we can reuse the responses, as long as informed consent allows us to, we can use it for other purposes. So those are some of my thoughts of how to maybe combat that, although I'm sure it's not even close to resolving the issues.
Could you go more in depth about this open source data?
Yeah.
That is happening in the University of Arizona? Or?
So NIH and so National Institutes of Health and NSF, National Science Foundation, and a few other pretty big funders of research in 2023, January of 2023, their new rule is any data that you collect, the de-identified data has to be deposited into like a data repository that could be used by researchers around the world. So the expectation now is, at least in the United States, is if you're receiving federal dollars to do your research, then you got to share the data that you find with everybody else. There are instances in which a researcher can request an exemption for that. And a good exemption would be maybe you're doing research with a native tribe and they say, nope, you can't reuse this data for any other purpose. You can request to your federal funding source that, your data not be included in an open source platform repository, and they'll approve it in cases like that. But for the most part, if you're getting federal dollars, you have to share your data worldwide.
Mhm.
Right.
Is that, sorry.
Go ahead, Liz.
Well, I was thinking of this case where a U.S. university was making investigations on genetic material on the maize, and it was interesting because we had to cut a deal with the towns, and here we entered a international agreement with the U.S. and some other institutions, because this was UCLA and at Davis, I think. No, UC at Davis.
Yeah.
And these were federal dollars, but we were talking about very restricted information of Mexican that were in that moment of Mexican interest, no, maize genetic material. No?
Mm-hmm.
So we had to enter, but we entered this agreement of confidentiality because of the subject matter. No.
Yeah.
And there are other subject matter that may be of federal, national security or whatever other reasons, or as in this case, property, of the information, industrial property. So there are a number of sections in the law that can be applied to certain information coming from individuals of certain communities, because they have the knowledge. But the knowledge is not only of them, of these individuals, or this individual. They are from the community.
Right.
So it's important that we take into consideration, because it's not just a matter of I want to know what your source of food. It might be a special food, and it might be that you are revealing and you are inadvertently revealing some source that is protected by laws, or that is of public of community knowledge, and this is protected by the community, and therefore you cannot use that information, or you will be infringing some laws if you use the information. It's not that easy. It's quite complex, actually.
Yeah, it is. I didn't even think about contracts and negotiations and agreements. I mean, that could take on a life of its own in this presentation. But
Right.
it is what makes those beginning discussions so crucial, because these expectations need to be outlined in agreements and understandings. So that's a great point. I'm going to share this with Hilda, just some additional resources, some good reads, if interested. And I know we're at time, but if anyone has questions, feel free to throw those out. I'm also going to leave my contact information. If you ever want to pick my brain or have a chat, feel free. I think I'm best reached by email. Feel free to reach out to me.
Thank you so much.
Yeah.
Thank you, Christine. Thank you very much for participating in this in the presentation. It was wonderful, and I just want to invite again to academic community to visit el Colegio de la Frontera Norte Research Ethical Committee website for more information, and thank you very much for being part of this group.
Thank you so much. Appreciate everyone's time. Take care.
Okay, well, thank you.
Thank you.
Ya estamos nosotros.
Sí, hasta luego.
Nos vemos.
Adiós.
Bye.